Good evening and welcome to our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here for our final Wellesley Votes discussion, a reflection on the 2020 presidential election that the work continues and what it revealed about the state of American democracy and its future. Jennifer Chudy, our Knopfel Assistant Professor of Social Sciences and Assistant Professor of Political Science, will be moderating tonight's discussion with Jocelyn Benson, Wellesley Class of '99, Michigan's Secretary of State, and Hakeem Jefferson, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. While the election is over, our work as citizens is not. As individuals and as members of the Wellesley community, we really must continue the hard work of democratic engagement. When I say democratic, I say that with a small d. Each of us must remain committed to building a more just and equitable world, to connecting across differences, and to uplifting the dignity of all people. Based on what I've seen from our community throughout this election season, I have no doubt that Wellesley is up to this task. And just to begin the introductions, we are thrilled to have Jocelyn Benson, Secretary Benson, here with us today. And I've just made the statement that the election is over, but the controversies continue. And as you know, Secretary Benson is in the middle of this right now. Jocelyn Benson, Class of '99, is a proud graduate of Wellesley and Michigan's 43rd Secretary of State. In the midst of an ongoing pandemic and in the face of our heated and at times violent national political climate, Secretary Benson acted with courage and decisiveness to ensure that every eligible voter who wished to cast a ballot in this election could do so safely and securely, without fearing for their safety or their health. By pushing to ban the open carry of firearms at the polls, and by mailing absentee ballot applications to every qualified voter in the state, Secretary Benson demonstrated her commitment to protecting the voting rights of all residents of Michigan, helping to make it safer and easier for citizens to participate in this election. Her efforts helped to spur the largest voter turnout in Michigan's history. 5.5 million people voted in the state, the most ever, and the highest percentage of voting age residents to cast a ballot in 60 years. And in the aftermath of the election, she's been an essential spokesperson for the democratic process, standing up to baseless claims of voter fraud. Her leadership in this election exemplifies the very best of Wellesley, and we are so proud of her and grateful for her efforts. Secretary Benson is the author of State Secretaries of State, Guardians of the Democratic Process, and the first major book on the role of Secretary of State in enforcing election and campaign finance laws. She's also the chair of Michigan's Task Force on Women in Sports, created by Governor Whitmer in 2019 to advance opportunities for women in Michigan as athletes and sports leaders. A graduate of Harvard Law School, an expert on civil rights law, education law, and election law, she served as the dean of Wayne State University Law School in Detroit. When she was appointed dean at age 36, she became the youngest woman in US history to lead a top 100 accredited law school. Previously, Secretary Benson was an associate professor and associate director of Wayne's Law Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. Secretary Benson, we are so thrilled to have you, and what I want to say to you is welcome home. Hakeem Jefferson is an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University, where he is also a faculty affiliate with the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at the Stanford Center for American Democracy. A native of South Carolina, Professor Jefferson received his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan in 2019. I think we have a Michigan theme going on here, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from political science and African American Studies from the University of South Carolina in 2011. Professor Jefferson's research focuses on questions related to identity and the multifaceted ways that identity structures social and political realities. He's particularly interested in the politics of stigmatized groups, and his scholarly efforts focus primarily on understanding diversity in the politics of Black Americans. He's currently at work on a book that examines the politics of respectability and that aims to provide a careful theoretical framework and novel measures of respectability to help make sense of Black Americans' support for tough on crime laws and punitive social welfare policies. Jennifer Chudy, our moderator tonight, is the Knopfel Assistant Professor of Social Sciences and an Assistant Professor of Political Science at Wellesley. Her research focuses on the role of race in American politics. Specifically, she looks at how attitudes about race shape political behavior like voting and protesting. She has published work on racial prejudice, guilt, and sympathy, and her insights have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vox, and 538. At Wellesley, Professor Chudy teaches courses related to American politics, political psychology, and race and ethnicity in American politics. She also organizes political scientists of color and affinity group for Wellesley students of color interested in studying political science. She worked in politics prior to graduate school and has experiences at the state, local, and national levels of government. Secretary Benson, Professor Jefferson, and Professor Chudy, it is truly a pleasure and an honor to welcome you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. You know, the panelists and I, we have something very special in common. We were all Marshall Scholars. No, just kidding, that's just Secretary Benson. Instead, we are all past or present residents of the great state of Michigan. This is where Hakeem and I were. And so we have a lot of fun memories of our time spending graduate school in Secretary Benson's great state. So it makes the conversation extra special today, and we're really looking forward to our chat. Michigan has been in the news a lot, and on that note, Secretary Benson will have to depart our session at 7:45 today because she has some important media engagements. So I just mentioned that so that if you have questions that you would like to direct to her, to make sure you enter them in the chat on the early side so that we can have enough time to get to them. So we wanted to have this panel a little after the election for a few reasons. For political scientists like Professor Jefferson and myself, this time elapsed allows us some space to reflect on election night. As data pours in, we'll kind of pour over it over many years, but even a few weeks can provide a valuable perspective as we try to zoom out of the news cycle and understand the bigger picture. And for public servants like Secretary Benson, who've been working through the extended process of confirming our election results, during this time, we've seen some really unprecedented practices related to voter integrity. And so I thought I would actually begin our conversation today with Secretary Benson, just hearing from her directly about some of the recent news that has come out of Michigan with controversy in Wayne County earlier this week, and then today hearing from President Trump's that he's invited Michigan Republican leaders to meet with him at the White House. Just tell us a little bit about what you've been seeing, your impression of this, extended process of confirming the results. And we'll start with the present, and then we'll kind of move to bigger themes from there.
There we go. Thank you, first of all, for having me here tonight. It's such a joy and honor to be back, and Wellesley was such a critical, formative part of my growth in so many ways. And I could spend all evening just talking about that, and I wish I could. But know that it means a lot to me to be connected to Wellesley, to be here with all of you. And I always remember when deciding where to go to college, watching a video, an admissions video that talked about how much confidence that some admissions officer had in her little finger, and how that caused someone to want to go so that she could have similar confidence to be a leader and to be to really embrace the ethos of Wellesley of serving and public service and service in many capacities. So my work, both as a public servant and someone who seeks to be a servant leader, is really formed out of that Wellesley ethos. And I'm grateful for it, and grateful for my years there that were, again, really built the foundation for me to enter the work that I've done today. Shortly after I graduated, I actually went to Alabama. I worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center, investigating hate groups and hate crimes around the country. And it was there where I was really inspired to continue the work of those who stood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in March of 1965, and ensure that the work that and the battles that were fought over our democracy, not just in Selma, but throughout our history, continued as with leadership in the legal system and political. So I became an election lawyer because I wanted to ensure we could, protect the vote through the law and through the Constitution. And we saw actually in the 2000 election how a Secretary of State out of Florida had a very detrimental role to the elections process. And I very much wanted to be a Secretary of State ultimately when I ran for this position, having written a book on the office as well prior to running, examining the role, talking about all the ways in which the Secretary of State guards the democratic process as a chief election officer for the state. Certainly worked now for the past 2 years upon taking office to play that role of trying to be a nonpartisan, collaborative, solution-oriented, data-driven leader and Secretary of State. And so I say all that to kind of, underscore the question of the current moment we're now in, which is, here we are 20 years later, 20 years after that 2000 election that was very close, of course, significantly closer than this year's presidential election by far, but still following the closing of the polls that year, just as this year, you saw significant amount of challenges, questions, uncertainty about the process and the results of the election. Now, notably here, this time around, there actually is not a lot of uncertainty. I mean, Michigan's 2020 presidential elections were a secure, transparent, very successful, high turnout process where the results ultimately and truly accurately reflect the will of the people, where there were very few close elections. And of course, the candidates who ran statewide, both in the presidential column and the Senate column, the differences between those candidates were quite significant, far beyond the scope of any type of automatic recount or anything like that that would indicate it's a close election. But what I'm particularly proud of, and that we can't, we sort of knew three things coming into this election cycle, and we can't forget. Number one, we knew that we were going to see, and we were on track to see, record numbers of people voting. And indeed, we had 5.5 million people vote in Michigan's election this year. That's more than ever before in our state's history. And then on top of that, the second thing we knew was that more people were going to vote by mail or vote absentee or vote early than ever before. And that also ended up being accurate. 3.2 million citizens voted prior to Election Day, either through the mail or through their local drop box. And in doing so, that was, by the way, 3 times the number of people who voted early in 2016. In doing so, it really impacted the way in which our ballots were counted and our entire infrastructure of elections was set up, but also enabled us to have the 3 or so million people who voted on Election Day do so safely, securely, without crowds, without lines, and without any type of problems. So I say all that to say, the first 2 points, our elections were quite successful, quite secure, quite smooth. And it really wasn't until Wednesday evening, after we were after the announcement of the winner of Michigan's elections, President-elect Joe Biden, was made by the media networks based on the evidence and data and the unofficial tabulations, which were complete at that point, that we started to see the types of disruption and unrest and challenges that we've now been enduring over the past 2 weeks. And I say all that to say that the other big thing we knew coming into this election was that misinformation and efforts to sow seeds of doubt among the electorate about the integrity of the process were going to proliferate prior to the polls closing as an effort to deter people from voting. We knew they would occur to a certain extent on election day and in the time surrounding the count. But we certainly, certainly been disappointing to see those efforts to erode the public's confidence, falsely so, in a very well-run election and process continue for so far after, when the results of the election are quite clear. And again, that's now bringing us to the present, the moment we're now in. We're continuing to see a lot of noise, a lot of efforts to cause confusion about who won Michigan and who won the election, and put out a lot of false information. But the bottom line is, despite all these post-election shenanigans, the will of the people is clear, and the people of Michigan have made a choice. There's no legal or factual basis to question that choice. There's no evidence of widespread fraud or irregularities, and so with that, I have confidence we're going to move forward. We're going to get through this moment and do what we need to do, and then that the procedures allow, and then we're going to have to do the important work of bringing people together to ensure that these post-election shenanigans that we're seeing don't cause lasting harm to our democracy and people's faith in their vote.
Oh, thank you for that very thorough response. You discussed a number of innovations that you introduced as Secretary of State to ensure a really safe and secure election during the unprecedented experience of a pandemic. And so, I wanted to bring Professor Jefferson in here about his perspective about how some of these modifications to voting procedures may have impacted the composition of the record-breaking electorate that turned out in not only in Michigan, but in other states who made these provisions as well.
So I joined the Secretary in thanking Professor Chudy, my dear friend, and the Wellesley faculty and staff for having me. This is an honor to be on the panel with the both of you. I've been shocked too, Madam Secretary, by the sort of shenanigans we've seen. And perhaps we can get back to what this means for people's faith in democracy and the like moving forward. But I think the pandemic provided quite an opportunity, and I'd be interested in hearing the Secretary speak more about it, to innovate in these ways that activists and others have been really, really pushing for some time, to make it easier for folks to vote. And so I'm a collaborator on a piece where we find that once Colorado implemented all-mail voting, along with other measures too to make it easier to vote, that they saw, as one might expect, a significant increase in voter turnout. And this turnout was particularly located among low propensity voters, those for whom these barriers to entry are particularly burdensome. So lower income folks, folks who work in low wage jobs where they have difficulty taking time off work, racial and ethnic minorities for whom these burdens are particularly severe. And so when we make it easier to vote, people engage the electoral process. And so it's without a doubt that these measures implemented in places across the country where secretaries of state work to ensure that people could engage the electoral process while also not falling victim to the COVID crisis, undoubtedly helped to increase turnout. Of course, you also had a very unpopular incumbent and Donald Trump, who what we call negative partisanship, this sort of opposition to the incumbent, certainly mobilized those in the Democratic Party. And the president too was able to turn out his base of supporters. But we post-COVID and the like should look to these measures if we're serious about a more inclusive electoral participation. But the reality is that as we've seen these attacks on mail-in voting and other measures to make it easier to vote, we ought not believe for one second that a more inclusive democracy is what all of our public officials are pining for. There are those for whom a more exclusive franchise protects power in a way that they prefer. But the hope is that after COVID, we still have many of these measures in place that have made it easier for people to vote.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to respond, or I mean, I think something that we're touching on, and since Secretary Benson wrote a whole book about secretaries of state, she's probably best positioned to address this question. When you entered the job, was your understanding that this was a particularly polarized task at hand? Your office was something that was going to kind of engage with a lot of partisan affairs or issues, or has this kind of polarization caught you by surprise in its relationship to a process which I don't know if you would say should be nonpartisan, is in concept nonpartisan? If you could talk maybe a little bit about the kind of dimensions of your responsibility of Secretary of State and the ways in which partisanship have touched it as you've experienced it this year.
Yeah, I mean, no question. The role of the chief election officer, as well as local election administrators, should and must be nonpartisan. I mean, we're the referees of democracy. We don't take sides, and we've worked very hard in my department to make sure that's the case. Building, a staff around expertise that's committed to integrity and data-driven decision making, as opposed to political decisions that would further some sort of partisan agenda. My work throughout my career has been very nonpartisan, in focused on just ensuring everyone can vote and has access to accurate information about how to do so. And that's really the job of the Secretary of State and local election officials. So it has been interesting to see really the partisanship play out most concretely and most disappointingly when it comes to policy making. And certainly our state legislature, and you see this nationally as well with Congress and the U.S. Senate, being very much bogged down in partisanship. And so when you need, in our case, the state legislature to be a partner in ensuring that everyone can vote, regardless of how they vote or who they vote for, when they fail to be that partner due to partisan reasons, it's incredibly disheartening. And it also, is unnecessary, because it always has struck me that for every elected leader in the legislature, these are their voters too. These are their constituents as well, that deserve, again, regardless of where they live or who they're going to vote for, or what party they're affiliated with, they deserve equal access to the vote and a secure elections process. So that has been disheartening. It's been 2 years now, and I'm still not accustomed to it. It's just it's unfortunate and frustrating, and certainly demoralizing, but pales into concern, quite frankly, of a lot of the partisanship we've seen in the past 2 weeks, as national efforts to undermine the will of the people have really taken center stage in our state.
Yeah, I wonder, Hakeem, maybe you can bring in some insight from political science about what is responsible for the polarization we've seen that has affected Secretary Benson's work. You mentioned that negative partisanship might have motivated many folks to go out and support Trump. Is this a new phenomenon that we're seeing now in 2020, or talk a little bit about the development of our polarized partisan divide?
Yeah, we're both Michigan trained, Jen, so we know that partisanship is some of our colleagues might say, a hell of a drug, and has been for some time in American politics. And the role of partisanship isn't particularly new. I think what we're seeing currently is striking, even to those who have studied partisanship and polarization for some time. We have a political elite and a political party, right, that's sort of relying on partisanship to stoke disinformation and misinformation about the electoral process in ways that undermine the democratic will of the people. And this is sort of new, at least to this extent. And so this is partisanship on steroids, we might call it, where you see election commissioners who are partisan. They have partisan identities in Michigan, just like many of us. But you can trust that they act as referees, as the secretary mentioned. And what we're seeing, I think, is a kind of elite polarization, right, that's being sort of poured down to the masses. And so when we see folks in Michigan taking up arms against the governor's mask mandates and the like, efforts to protect public health, or when we see people banging on the doors of counting places where ballots are being counted, that's a kind of partisanship that's mixed with a lot of other stuff. It's mixed with a kind of white identity that we've seen emerge more in American politics in recent years, and we're seeing it with a tinge of extremity that I certainly don't remember seeing in 2000, as we had the Brooks Brothers lawyers sort of running in. We didn't have threats of violence that we see now, and so I think this is catching some political scientists off guard too, Jen. And this is certainly a manifestation of partisan polarization, but we should note its extreme manifestation, I think.
Yes, extreme, unprecedented, certainly ways to describe our current political moment. We're about to transition to some questions for Secretary Benson, but before we do, I wanted to ask both Secretary Benson and Professor Jefferson to talk. Each state makes its own election rules, runs elections in its own way. What are the pros and cons of this kind of patchwork system of running a national election? Is this kind of election federalism a good thing? Would more centralization be a good thing? What do you think, Secretary Benson?
Well, certainly the federal government has an important role to play, and they have historically at setting the baseline of standards of what the expectations are and should be for every voter in the country. The protections in place, obviously, the Voting Rights Act being a really banner example of that, as well as the Help America Vote Act and many other pieces of federal legislation. They also play an important role in those legislative arenas of funding and supporting resources for elections. Certainly, the CARES Act funding that we received in Michigan, the $11.2 million, was really critical in enabling us to provide PPE and install drop boxes and do everything we needed to do to prepare to hold historically high turnout election in the midst of a pandemic. That notwithstanding, states have a very unique role to play as well in ensuring we are meeting our voters directly where they are at and delivering to them the type of democracy that ensures it's equally accessible and secure. And that may look different. That may be different in various different states. What is sort of lost, though, is best practices. We certainly, and I've tried to do this with my administration, we certainly have things to learn from states who, for example, implemented risk limiting audits long before we did. Although we're about to do one here in Michigan, we worked with the former Secretary of State of Colorado, Wayne Williams, and others who implemented them in other states to help us get up to speed and implement things quite quickly here. And of course, to move from a scenario where just 2 years ago, you had to register to vote 30 days prior to Election Day in Michigan, and you couldn't vote early or absentee without a reason. Now, within 2 years, we had to prepare for a presidential election in which you could register to vote up to and on Election Day, as well as allow for a right to vote from home or vote absentee. And so being able to talk to states like Kim Wyman, the Secretary of State in Washington, and adapt and learn from their experiences has been key in us in being able to implement the same policies here. So I think it's an important balance to place, and really the collaboration amongst states is also critical, either in the absence of leadership at the federal level or certainly in addition to the federal government's role, so that we can learn from each other, adjust and adapt our own systems in a way that our voters respond to and want, but also ensure we're not recreating the wheel unnecessarily.
Thank you. Professor Jefferson, do you want to add your insights about what it means that we have some uniformity, but also a lot of variation when it comes to conducting elections in this country?
Yeah, so political scientists often think of the system of federalism that we have, this sort of relationship between the state and the federal government as being a good thing. It allows for these laboratories of democracy, we might call it, right? So you can play with ideas in this place that might be suitable for voters here, but might not be so suitable for voters over there, right? So we often think of the greatest strength of federalism is that it can act as these sort of laboratories of democracy. But we should, and I think that's what Secretary Benson just pointed out quite nicely, and you can learn from what other states have done. And so I'll just take the less optimistic side, I suppose. States have long served as these first sites of democratic backsliding. And so we can think about the period of Jim Crow. We can think about the current patchwork that Jen and Secretary Benson just talked about, where in some states, it's quite hard to engage the franchise, right? It's easier in some states to get a gun than it is to get access to the ballot. We might think that's problematic, particularly in a post-Shelby world where the Supreme Court thought it a good idea to take the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act. We see states implementing harsher voter ID laws, closing down polling places, engaging in efforts to really suppress the vote. And so I think in that way, we might, at the very least, want Congress and members of Congress, and this is, I think, a place where those in the audience who are thinking, like, what can I be advocating for in a post-Trump world? What can I sort of force the hand of President-elect Joe Biden and his administration to do, and those in Congress? I think it's to pass a new Voting Rights Act, right? That allows the federal government to hold these states accountable, that make it more difficult for people to vote. That, as a judge in North Carolina said, with surgical precision, trying to keep people out of the electoral process. And so I think while states can operate as these laboratories for democracy, we ought to be sort of on guard, watching for the ways that they engage in this kind of democratic backsliding. And we ought to not just focus all our attention on what's happening in Washington, but look at what's happening in the states as well.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure we move to some questions before Secretary Benson has to depart. And we have a lot of questions coming in about kind of the technicalities of what's going on in your state, what could happen, what's going to happen. I'll kind of group them together because I think they're all on this topic. You know, what happens if the Michigan State Board of Canvassers fails to certify the results of the election? Are you at all concerned that the Electoral College members will change their vote? You know, do you have insights to share about kind of this question that's very newsworthy and on a lot of folks' minds?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in Michigan, you know, as I mentioned before, we are in a moment. It's a very challenging one, but it's also very clear that the voters of Wayne County and the voters of Michigan have spoken. It's also very clear that there's no legal or factual basis to question their choice. There's been no evidence presented, despite significant scrutiny on our elections, of any type of irregularities or widespread fraud. There have been a lot of press releases making allegations, but there's actually been no evidence behind those allegations, as several courts and others have verified. So that said, we have to have calm and steady confidence in the truth and the facts and the data in our state. There was an election. The American people have spoken. The Michigan voters have very clearly spoken, and we are now in a process of certifying that election. Every county has actually gone through the process of canvassing and the protocol that's in place to assure that the election should be certified, and it's now ready to be certified by the State Board of Canvassers. That plays a ministerial administrative role in this process. And so it's important to note that, you know, there's not a lot of wiggle room in the law for baseless reasonings to reject the will of the voters. In fact, the Board of Canvassers at the state and county level have a very clear role to play particularly in situations like ours, where there is no evidence of any wrongdoing or any, as I mentioned, irregularities, to certify the vote and affirm the will of the people, so that we can begin, among other things, the post-election process of following up on our procedural audit of Wayne County and other localities that had some clerical errors, and working through them to find explanations. Oftentimes those clerical errors are issues like a voter shows up at a polling place and goes to the wrong table and signs in at the wrong precinct, and then signs in another precinct. Different things like that. And the work really in the procedural audit after certification is for us to answer those questions. And then we'll also, as I mentioned, be performing the state's first ever risk limiting audit statewide for a presidential election. And that will be able to continue and as well once the vote is certified at the meeting of the State Board of Canvassers on Monday. So I have full confidence and expect the State Board of Canvassers to do the law that is and the work that is very clearly laid out before them. That there's really not a lot of wiggle room in the law to allow anything else but that. And then, you know, we have to recognize that everything else you're hearing is noise designed to erode public's confidence in what was a very well-run process, and see it as that, call it out as that, and respond to that misinformation with truth and with facts. And so again, as different things pop up, and they'll continue to, I'm sure, in the days ahead, and maybe even in the weeks that follow, for Michigan, you can go to our website, michigan.gov/SOS fact check, to confirm and evaluate any rumors you're hearing, or submit some of your own for us to verify.
Thank you. I mean, it sounds kind of like your work won't be done because something that another participant brings up is, after this, you'll have future elections, and how, will you assure voters who through various channels have heard misinformation, have heard inaccurate evidence, that, elections are safe, are fair in Michigan? Is there a way to combat that misinformation in your mind, given that, as Professor Jefferson said, we are living in a highly polarized political environment?
We certainly are in a very unique moment, and the only thing that can really take us out of it is the people and the people's voices, and all of us working together to lead with truth and with facts, as opposed to misinformation or spreading false information. And so really the same counsel we gave to voters leading into this election, which was, don't spread false information. If you see something that seems odd, share it with us so we can correct it. Be a part of correcting the record and ensuring truth and facts lead the day. That still holds true now, that we all have worked together to heal this divide we're in, to heal our elections process and move forward from this, and to recognize that there are forces in play that are trying to oppose that very effort, but they can't win. They shouldn't win. And that the truth and the facts and the data are, and frankly, the vast majority of Michiganders and American people are on the side of democracy. And so we're going to continue moving forward with that, and counseling others, and calling on the public to do the same. That's how we get through this. And if anything is instructive of this, we can look to history, and of course, even just this year itself, which was that we were, at least in Michigan and nationwide, able to successfully hold elections, push back against efforts to misinform the public about how to vote, where to send your ballot, all those things. We got through that through education, through speaking the truth, and through engaging others on both sides of the aisle and helping to spread that true information and trusted information.
Okay, question for both of you. So can you talk a little bit about, you introduced many innovations and new ideas because we have this pandemic. Are those innovations here to stay now? Do you think that's going to become a standard part of voting? And what are, the promises of that and challenges of that as well?
Well, certainly in Michigan, they are actually part of our Constitution. Voters amended our state constitution in 2018 to create a series of new election reforms: automatic voter registration, election day registration, a right to vote from home, a mandate for post-election audits, all of those that we're engaged in implementing now, as well as, of course, creating Michigan's first independent citizens redistricting commission, which is actually right now met today to continue their process of drawing the next round of congressional and legislative districts for the state of Michigan from citizens, not politicians. So that work continues. And so I emphasize, like, we're in a moment, a post-election moment of a very contentious and highly scrutinized election, but it is one in which we will move through and will continue to improve democracy as we go along, taking data from this year to make those improvements. But the broad, at least in Michigan and in many other states like Pennsylvania and Arizona, these positions are here to stay. Certainly our drop boxes, our infrastructure in all around the state, for example, at the granular level, that are also, we hope and expect, here to stay to provide voters an opportunity to return their ballots. So we're going to continue that forward progress and really be ultimately grateful for a lot of what we learned this year. The infrastructure of elections and democracy is not something that I'm concerned about as much as I'm concerned about the real effort, concerted and really from international as well as actors here in the United States, to sow those wrongly seeds of doubt, false seeds of doubt amongst the public about the actual very strong position our election infrastructure is in.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think it's going to be hard to return to a system where it's more challenging for people to vote. I think citizens have become accustomed to the cycle, to being able to drop a ballot off or mail it in. And I think that's going to be really hard to sort of go back on. I think the secretary is right, however, that the partisan efforts to undermine, say, for example, mail-in voting, I don't doubt for a second that that will continue. And so what's interesting moving forward is to see whether the partisan differences that we observed in the mode of voting this cycle, for example, will continue, or will Republicans find that making it easier for their voters to vote is advantageous as well. And so I think that's the interesting question moving forward, is whether we'll see these sort of partisan divides that we saw this cycle that we haven't actually observed in places where these processes have been in place before. This cycle is unique in the attacks on mail-in voting and other modes of voting that were easier for people to engage the cycle. I think that's where the attention should be focused moving forward.
Okay, and one last question before Secretary Benson has to depart. For many young voters, many Wellesley students, they've learned that election integrity, the election process, is a really fascinating and important topic. So if they would want to continue to engage in work in this area, what advice do you have for them on immersing themselves in this really crucial field?
Well, it's exactly that. Such a crucial field for us all to be engaged in many levels. And I think it all hones down to, what democracy is about, which is really empowering every voice to be a part of our community and be a part of self-governance. And how do we do that? How do we ensure people's voices are continuing to dominate the electoral landscape? And so you have certainly a legal path to do that. Obviously, election law is a very growing field, a political science path as well, because certainly data and evaluating the impact of policy certainly helps inform policies' continued implementation, but also consider serving as an election administrator, certainly serving as a poll worker, but actually being one of the people on the front lines in protecting our elections, whether at the statewide level as a Secretary of State or serving at the local level on boards of elections. If anything, we've seen this cycle how important it is to have people of integrity, people committed to a fair and just process of elections and election administration to be in those positions. So certainly take your role as a voter in electing those folks seriously, but don't hesitate to run yourself as well for those positions, because we need good, smart people in all of them.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. We know you have a lot on your plate, and we're so appreciative you could spend time with us today.
Best of luck.
Yeah, good luck.
A little bit. Thanks.
Thank you.
See you back in person soon. Bye.
Bye. Well, wonderful. We'll continue our conversation now with Professor Jefferson, who's an expert on racial and ethnic politics in America. So I want to kind of redirect the conversation a little bit that way. And we have some questions that have come in on that topic. But, a little bit, Professor Jefferson, from your perspective, there's been a lot of coverage about the election so far. For good reason. It's so interesting, it's so important. And in particular, there's been a lot of attention paid to some of the initial exit polls, which reveal potentially some interesting trends with respect to race and ethnicity in the 2020 election. Can you give us some insight into how political scientists might think about this initial data and your own read of the forces at play in the 2020 election, insofar as we can diagnose that so far?
Yeah, I think this is a fun question. So I think what you're referring to is a lot of the top lines that have come out about Black voters and Latino voters, and the sort of peculiar numbers, we might call them, of Black support or Latino support for the outgoing president, President Trump. And for example, one number that many folks in the audience might have seen is this 18% of Black men in the exit poll data cast their ballot for President Trump. And so I think, as Professor Chudy noted at the start, we ought to be a little skeptical of those who have these answers so soon after an election finishes. And perhaps just to add on to that caution is that exit poll data is notoriously bad at mapping onto the kind of data that we get from precinct level inferences and analyses in the weeks following an election, right? And so these exit polls are used fairly often to give some sense of what's happening as the election is ongoing. And so those who are really attuned to this stuff, as I am, and I know many in the audience are, you can get these sort of throughout the election day reports on what's happening. And then you got a sort of final read. But in focusing so much on national level pictures, exit poll data is, again, notoriously bad at doing some of these sort of subgroup analyses, particularly for voters of color. And this is in part as folks at Latino Decisions, where I commend folks to go visit, have noted in the past, is that the way that exit polls are conducted, they're often not conducted at precincts and that are in highly or densely populated minority areas. And then this is a little in the weeds, the way that they end up weighting the data to account for the imbalance of people of color in the data can make, one or two Black folk in the data have more voice and appear more representative than they actually are in the population. And so what I caution against is taking this exit poll data to say anything really fine-grained, particularly about minority communities. These top lines are certainly interesting. And in my own research, I'm really fascinated by the diversity in Black public opinion, for example. But I wouldn't run to the bank just yet with the kind of exit poll data that we've seen. There are just too many reasons. The unrepresentativeness of those who are in the exit poll, particularly this election cycle, whereas we noted earlier, people are choosing modes of voting and who's in the data. And of course, they tried to make up for this by adding on a kind of phone calling to folks to supplement what's an imbalance on election day for those who actually turned out to vote in person. They tried to do some exit polling at the early drop-off locations. But again, all the kind of statistical noise that comes from trying to account for these various imbalances just makes me a little skeptical of this exit poll data. And so I think it's interesting. These top lines are certainly worth looking into a bit more, but I caution against making too many inferences yet based on that data.
Thank you. And one question that has come in is about identity and folks who voted in 2016. And in your earlier comments, you had mentioned the rise of white identity as a particularly important political force. And, with the caveat that 2020 is still a living, breathing election. We can't do the postmortem yet. Can you tell us a little bit about the role this attitude has played, perhaps in 2016, and what you imagine it might have played in 2020 as well?
Well, Professor Chudy is, of course, the expert here on the panel on white folk, but I'd be interested in Professor Chudy's insights as well. Perhaps we can have this as a sort of conversation. But I'll jumpstart us perhaps by noting that white identity, as our colleague and Michigan friend Ashley Jardina notes in her great book, which the audience should check out, White Identity Politics. White identity is quite a powerful force in American politics. And it's become a more powerful force, Jardina argues, and the evidence appears to support, as the country has become more diverse, as white folks have started or become even more concerned with their position in the racial hierarchy. And so Professor Chudy and I are really familiar with these frameworks that think about group position and the concerns that members of dominant groups have about maintaining that position in the status hierarchy. And so what happens as that position appears or is perceived to become more precarious, right? As you see an influx of immigrants, or as you feel like others are getting ahead as you're falling behind. There was this sort of false dichotomy among some scholars of whether we can understand Trump support as economic anxiety or a kind of racial animus. And what Professor Chudy and I know is that disentangling that is a fool's errand, right? That the white people sort of concerns about or their feelings of disaffection aren't divorced from their perceptions that others, read racial and ethnic minorities, are getting ahead as they're falling behind. And so it's this concern about group position that gives rise to white identity politics. And we saw it, of course, in 2016. Ta-Nehisi Coates has this fantastic essay where he writes that Donald Trump is America's first white president. And of course, what he means is not that he's the first white president, but he's the first white president who really, and I disagree with that at some level, but I think it's a good thesis. It really highlights the ways in which Donald Trump plays to white people's identity, the way that he talks about the suburbs, the way that he tells suburban women, for example, that I'm the candidate who's going to protect the suburbs. Read the white space where, of course, the suburbs have increasingly become diverse, but he's playing to white identity politics. When he's talking about certain policies, he's playing to this bit of white people's identity. And I think that's here to stay, unfortunately. I think that we'll see this post Trump's exit from the White House. I think it's one of the most dangerous forces in American politics today.
Okay, another question from the audience. What do you see as the biggest threat to the voting rights of minority voters?
I think it's the sort of complicity of political elites who work very hard day in and day out to make it harder for people to vote. I mean, we saw it during the pandemic, where any thinking person would be working to enable people to vote while also staying safe. And I think what we saw as Republicans pushed against these efforts, it's akin to what we've seen in many states with the implementation of tough voter ID laws or the shutting down of polling places, as I mentioned earlier. I think all of these concerted efforts to make it difficult for people to vote, and namely those people who are perceived to not work in line with the Republican Party orthodoxy, racial and ethnic minorities, young people, the poor, right? These efforts to make it more difficult to vote, I think, pose the greatest threats to the franchise. And I think those of us who are looking for ways to be active in the months and years to come, I think we should all become voting rights activists. We should be on the front lines asking for a redo of the Voting Rights Act, putting again the teeth into the Voting Rights Act to protect the franchise. I think is one of the most important things we can do moving forward.
I hear that. Can you speak a little bit about again, with the caveat that the results and the data are still very much in flux, but could you explain a little bit the role of Black voters, not only in this primary contest on the Democratic side, but in the eventual election? How is it similar? How does it seem on the surface similar or different than trends we've seen before with this community?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think Black voters are often given sort of short shrift in election cycles. And one of the things that was heartening, at least to me during the primary season, was to see the amount of media attention, for example, that was paid to Black voters. And I think this comes with a diversification of newsrooms. I'm thinking of Stead Herndon at the New York Times, who wrote brilliantly, I thought, about diversity and Black voters, or Perry Bacon at 538, who has done a nice job of really talking about the sort of heterogeneity or diversity in Black public opinion. And so I think there have been some really good efforts to really highlight this diversity and the complexity of Black people and Black people's politics. That's been really comforting. And I think the primary was a really great place to see this diversity. And for those who haven't read it yet, Stead Herndon had a great piece in the Times about young Black voters talking to their parents about, or their grandparents about their support for Joe Biden. And I think we still have a lot to learn, frankly, about this diversity, about a kind of perhaps pragmatic politics that one might observe. We still don't have good evidence of this yet, so I want to be careful. Maybe a kind of pragmatic politics that we observe among older African Americans who sort of understand that this is the system that we've got. And, you know, we know, as one of our colleagues, Chrissy Greer, said on another panel recently, that Black folks, perhaps particularly older Black folks, understand and know the capacity of white people and the kinds of candidates that white people might support. And so I think during the primary, we got a nice window into maybe a divide that we observed, maybe between a kind of pragmatic Black politics and a politics of imagination, perhaps, that we observed among younger African American voters who were saying, is this as good as we can get it, right? Is this the best that we can do? We're the backbone of the Democratic Party, and this is what we got. And so I think those divides are worth really pushing on and thinking more about. And I hope that, and I know that scholars are thinking about those questions, and we should keep puzzling over them. But I think one of the things that we observe as we look at places like Georgia and Philadelphia and Milwaukee and these other places, we see the power of the Black vote, and we see the power that Black folks wield in the Democratic Party. I think the question that's still open is whether that power can be sort of translated into policy outcomes that are targeted to Black folk and Black interests. Of course, Black interests, what is that? There is no Black vote, perhaps, or we can't sort of homogenize Black people in a particular way, but I think it certainly means progressive politics as it comes to criminal justice or redistributive policies. And so it stands to be seen whether the Biden-Harris administration will look at Black voters as more than this key voting bloc, but as a constituency worth really advocating on behalf of.
Oh, well, you mentioned Georgia, and I've just been notified that, as per the New York Times, the Georgia Secretary of State has confirmed the hand recount, confirming President-elect Biden's victory in the Peach State. So, you know, on this topic of we're going to continue to learn more, thank you to everyone for engaging in these really fascinating questions, for pushing the panelists to think about how to expand and extend upon the results of this really remarkable election that is still alive. You know, I said it's the election is still breathing. We're still learning from it, and it has been great to do so along such esteemed guests today. So thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at another event hosted by Wellesley in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to be here, Jen.